Hi everyone, as promised, I'm going to walk you through getting Serverpod to run in the cloud. Now that we have that little overview video, if you haven't seen it, go check it out because it'll probably make everything make a lot more sense. I put a lot of thought and care into that. So the video previous to this one kind of walks through what I did because it wasn't something I could fully, do live. I tried. It was a bit of a process, but basically we're going to get this going. So what I've done, I've set up just a new Serverpod project. It's the most basic Serverpod project ever. It's just the default one. I called it SP Cloud, Serverpod, because we're going to the cloud. And I created one model, which has, it's a to-do, because that's like what you do, right? You make a to-do app. We're not really going to make the app. We're not going to care about the Flutter side. We're just going to get this running on the server. So we don't care about the endpoints. We don't care about the Flutter side of things, or even really the client. We're only going to care about the server. So that's all I have. I've started Docker, so I have Docker running somewhere in this world. Yep, SP Cloud Server. And we've run the migrations. So basically, if you have a Serverpod project that's already working locally, you're ready to go. So I am going to use Heroku this time, and I'm planning possibly make another video after this where we just try and get this running on everything I can think of. So that you guys can have your choices. Everyone has a, ultimately we want the cheapest one. Maybe we'll figure out what's the cheapest place to host this, especially for just like ongoing development, test flight, before you get into production. So let's get started. So yeah, again, just simple basic project, nothing special happening here. The first thing we're going to do is we are going to make a heroku.yaml file or .yml file. I think both are fine. And in this file, we need to tell Heroku what to do. So in the build process, we're going to use Docker. And let's make this a little bit bigger. And what we want to do is run a web service. And we're going to go, note this file is in the root directory of my monolith. So it's not inside Serverpod Cloud. So now we need to say, hey, we want to go inside SP Cloud Server. And then we're going to go to the Docker file, just like that. So we're going to do that. Now, let's go to Heroku. And I'm just going to go to my personal Heroku apps. And we are actually going to make a new app. If you don't want to use Heroku, again, in a future video, we might try some other services, but the process is pretty similar with DigitalOcean or Render or whatever. It's just obviously like I'm showing in Heroku. So we're just going to call this SP Cloud, or maybe I'll call it Serverpod in the cloud. Amazing. And it's available. That's perfect. So we can choose a region. We'll just do United States, and we're just going to create the app. All right. So now, if you haven't used Heroku before and you're following along, you need to install the Heroku CLI. I already have it. And then you're going to want to run Heroku login, which I don't really have to do, but I will show you how it works. Heroku login, and just click any key, and just click login. And it's going to talk back to your terminal in some magical way and make this thing, sort of work. So now we're logged in. Then what we need to do is, first of all, let's go to the root directory of our project. So again, this is, if I ls, you'll see I'm just in this, basically, I'm right here in my pwd, my print working directory, pwd. There we are. Here we are. And we want to make sure we git init this. And then you would want to, likely set up, your normal GitHub project, all that kind of stuff. And in fact, yeah, let's just do that because that's something you're going to want to likely do. So I'm going to go to GitHub, and I'm going to make a new repository, and we are going to just call it Serverpod in the cloud. And I'll make it public. Yeah, that sounds good. All right, then. What are we going to do? Well, we can follow most of these things, but we've already done the git init, I believe. Yeah, we already git initted. Really what we want, I'm going to do this. We want to add a remote origin so that it knows, hey, that's where we're going to push this code to. And then we're going to do a git add dot git commit dash m. We'll just call it initial commit. And we're going to do git push dash u origin main because we want to go to the main branch, which we do. And now if we refresh this, we'll see it. So yay, we're on GitHub. Cool. Okay, so now we have that. Now with Heroku, Heroku uses Git as well. And if we go here, we actually see the settings. What we actually want to add now is a secondary remote. So we have our remote for GitHub, but we're actually going to run Heroku git remote. And again, you need the Heroku CLI to do this. And then we're just setting it to an app called Serverpod in the cloud. So we're doing that. And that will allow us to decide when we want to push to that remote. But what it is also doing, and the reason we're really doing this, is it's associating, and it's done actually through an interesting way. They use the .git folder. So if I actually go, there's a hidden folder inside any Git repo called .git. You don't see it in VS Code, but you'd see it in Finder if you have hidden files enabled. And if we actually look in here, it's going to actually use, if we looked at the config, let me just, I'll just open it in VS Code. If we look at this, it's actually going to see the origin for Heroku. And essentially the Heroku CLI is looking for something like this. And now it's associating this code base with that. So anytime we do something, setting a configuration variable in Heroku through the CLI, it knows which app we're talking to. So that's the main reason to do it. We're not actually going to need to use like what it's telling us to do next, which is actually pushing to Heroku main. We could do that, but we're actually going to set this up with a little bit of, not quite CI/CD, but kind of. All right, so what we want to do now is we're going to connect our project through GitHub. So I've already set up a connection and allowed it, and let's look for, it should be called Serverpod in the, that's probably enough to see it, Serverpod in the cloud. So we're going to connect this. This is one of the ways to do it. You could do it through this, or you could do it through a container registry, but we're doing it through this way. And we could decide to set up, anytime someone merges or pushes to main to actually do a deploy. But for our purposes, we're just going to do it manually, just so we can kind of click when we're ready to do it. We can see it go. If I was to do this now, it's just not going to work. In fact, let's just do it for fun. Let's deploy and just kind of see what happens. So it's going, it's retrieving the code. It's going to find that Docker file. It might do some stuff because there is already a Docker file, right? Serverpod comes with this lovely Docker file that we're going to be changing. But we're definitely going to have some major problems if it even goes. There we go. Yeah, it's determining which build pack. It's like, I have no idea. What is this? Push failed. Cool. And that's because we need to actually set our type to be a containerized app, which, if I remember correctly, so right now it's saying no frameworks detected. What we need to do is actually set it to be containerized. So 1 second, I just remember the command for this. Okay, so the command we want to run is Heroku stack set container. And we just need to run that within somewhere in our project because we've already instantiated the Heroku CLI to understand what app we're talking about on Heroku's side. And we're going to set that. And now actually if we go back to here, it does say container. Hey, I didn't have to refresh. That was kind of smooth. Refresh, and we will see container. Cool, it's still there. So now it knows it's going to use a container instead of trying to figure out, normally what Serverpod does, it looks for like a proc file and for things, or it looks like, okay, there's a requirements.txt file in here and some Python files. I'm going to use the Python build pack, or you can manually say what build pack to use, but we can't use a build pack. There's no Dart build pack, and even if there was, it wouldn't be set up the way you want. So we're using a container, and that's what Docker lets us do. So now inside Docker, we need to make some big changes here. The first thing I want to do is change the version of what we're getting from Docker registry. So we're going to use Dart 3.5.2. And just to explain what this is, I'm just going to Dart Docker, probably click here. So this is just an image. And if you go, this is the official Dart image. And there's a bunch of different tags, but I chose 3.5.2 because it's the closest one. I think I'm running 3.5.3 right now. Locally, I just wanted to be as close to that as possible. In an ideal world, I would actually use something like FVM locally and make sure that they're exactly the same, but that isn't really necessary for this tutorial. Okay, so we want to do that first. All this stuff is good. All this stuff is good here. This is still good. We won't actually need these, so I'm just going to get rid of those. Then we need to add a new command here. We want to do from build. We're actually going to get our app migrations folder. And what we want to do is take it and copy it just to migrations. So it's going to get it from basically when the build runs, which is happening here, from basically our application. We've created like a working directory, kind of like a temporary directory that's being used to do all this stuff. But we're saying we want to copy this over here and put it in our migrations. Then we still want to expose these ports. But before that, although the order probably doesn't matter, there's a few things we want to do. I mentioned in the last video, we're using something called supervisor. So we're going to actually have to copy over our supervisor configuration. Same with Nginx. So let's get those in place now. So within SP Cloud Server, I'm going to make a new file, and we're going to do. Let's start with Nginx. Let's start with supervisor. So I'm going to make a file called supervisor d.conf. Technically, the file name doesn't matter as long as you put it in the right place and rename it, but we'll just keep it, as expected. Now within here, what we're going to do is we're just going to set up, supervisor D, which is the main kind of like mothership that's going to be the process running. And within it, we're going to have two different processes. One of them is Nginx. So there we have Nginx. And the other one is our command to start the Dart server, because we want these two things need to run sort of separately. And the reason we need Nginx is because we need to do some reverse proxying to point one single domain and specific URLs to the different ports that that Serverpod runs on, so that we can have our web, our insights, and our application all running. So this command, we are going to hit a file called server on the root, and that's just because we are basically taking our bin.server and, we haven't actually put that code in yet, but we're basically saying, hey, run the server binary, apply migrations, because if there was some changes, we want to make sure we have them. Otherwise, our code and database will be out of sync. If there aren't migrations, it'll just fail gracefully. It just will be like nothing to run. We're setting the mode to production, server ID default. We just use that. Logging normal. And role, this is an important one, serverless, because we don't want to use the default monolith. This is a serverless application now because of the way we're containerizing everything. Okay, so we have all those there. Now I realize we missed one pretty important step because this stuff will not work. We actually need to install something. So right after Alpine latest, we are going to run a command. We're just going to use run in Docker, and we're going to use apk add, and we can do no cache. Not totally sure why, but that's what all the docs say to do. And we want to install Nginx. We also want to install bash. We also want to install curl, and we want to install supervisor for obvious reasons. So those will all run, apt get install, whatever, whatever it's going to do under the hood, depending on the Linux distro. Okay, so we have our supervisor D. Now we need to say, hey, okay, we want to copy that over. But these won't be part of our build stuff. It's not really Dart specific stuff. So we can simply just put this command here. It's just a copy command, just supervisor d.conf. So as long as it's a sibling of our Docker file, it'll know to find it in the same folder, which Docker file is here, supervisor.d here. It looks like it's spelled right. Cool. And what we want to do is we want to copy it to the etc supervisor conf d supervisor d.conf. And that's just where, when you install supervisor, these configuration files are set. And we want to overwrite the default one, or there might not even be one there. I'm not even sure. It might be just an empty file that we're making and then copying the stuff into. So we want to make sure we do that. Next, Nginx. So I'm going to make a new file called nginx.conf. And our Nginx file, I'm going to paste this in. I'm not going to type it all out, but and I think I explained it pretty well in the last one. But the main thing is, okay, we're setting up some worker processes, and then we're setting up 3 different app streams that are running on that are pointing to the Serverpod's different ports that are being used for the 3 things, right? The API, which is our main need, insights for analytics and stuff, and our web service, in case we wanted to host like our .com marketing site, built in Jasper or something, we could do that there. This is also important. The web service, although in our current OpenMic app, is not really a requirement. If you aren't using AWS for file storage, the web service is actually part of the flow to upload files and specifically to download and retrieve them. So you do need this sort of running. Then we actually configure our server, and this magic thing here is going to get inserted. A port will be inserted when we do the build based on whatever Heroku decided to randomly use as the port. Because again, on Heroku, they have a load balancer in front of everything that's running on port 443. That's the HTTPS port. But it ultimately does a port forwarding, kind of like what we're doing here. We're reverse port forwarding to a randomly assigned port. I don't know what they randomly decide on, but it's something random, probably math.random.round, something like that. And then we need to set, so we're setting this up because we don't want to have to point multiple domains here. And in fact, we can't really do that easily with something like a containerized application. What we're saying is if we come to the /API, we are going to proxy pass and point to this. So, our .com/API is going to be our API. But very importantly, we need to rewrite those URLs from the context of what our API service is actually going to see to not have that /API, because Serverpod will get confused. It's not expecting there to be an API. So we do this rewrite, everything's great. Same with insights. Same with web. The only difference here, we don't have to rewrite anything because web doesn't have, is just a /. It is what Serverpod would be expecting on that port. So yeah, basically like we're going to have our 443 on Heroku. point to Heroku's load balancer of our application in case we have multiple running, and that's going to point to a random port, which we're going to listen to. And then what we're going to do is if we see API, we're going to say, hey, go run, do this. Even though it's port 8080 and we're not ever going to have port 8080 in our URL, go there. And same with this, and same with this. So here's our Nginx. Beautiful. What's next? Well, we need to copy that over. So very similar to supervisor D, we're going to do that. Lastly, well, almost lastly, we're going to have a start script. So we're also going to make this as a sibling. We'll just call it start.sh. And in here, we want to first of all say, hey, this is a bash script. So we just say, hey, use bin bash when you try and execute this. And that's why we had to install bash. Then we're going to run this magic command. This took a lot to figure out how to do properly. But what this is going to do, it's going to look at our Nginx file after it's been copied, hence why we're going to be running this after. And on the file system, it's actually going to look for that insert port. So this little like placeholder we made here, which in theory we could call anything. I just decided insert port made sense. And we're going to replace it with this environment variable port that Heroku exposes for us. And in fact, I'm imagining things like render.com will too. We're going to get there. We're going to figure that out in a future video, what changes we might need to make this completely agnostic. But in my experience, there'll be something like this. Okay, so we want to do that, and that will replace it. Then we actually need to start things up. So we're going to run this command here. We're going to run exec supervisor d-c, so a command. And we're actually going to start the supervisor using this configuration file. And again, this was the configuration file that we copied over to this spot. And we're saying start supervisor using this file. OK, we're almost there. Then we want to copy over our start file that we just made, of course. And very importantly, we need to tell the operating system, hey, this file is an executable, meaning like give it permissions from essentially the system to execute it. And to do that, you just run a chmod plus x, so it's going to add execution permissions to our start.sh. Cool. Then what do? Well, we just need to run our start.sh. So we're actually going to, we'll keep the exposes, but we're going to get rid of this whole entry point thing. And instead of that, we're going to run a command, and it's just going to run that start command. And remember, this start command that we just made, here we go, is going to do that sed thing. Cool. And then it's going to start supervisor. And supervisor is going to go and start Nginx. And it's going to start the Dart server. And hopefully everything just works. OK, so wicked. Let's see. This won't work yet. We're not quite done. But I think this is like a big part of it. Let's just try pushing our changes. Let's call this Docker file and config files. And we'll just push that up, git push. OK, now we'll go back to Heroku because we haven't actually enabled the automatic deployments when something happens. So we'll just go to the deploy tab, and we're actually going to click this deploy branch. And let's just see what happens here. So I'm going to open this up so we can make it a little bit bigger for y'all at home. And we'll let this go. Okay, so you see now it's actually pulling stuff from Docker as opposed to before when it was just like, I don't know, like we didn't have the containerization set. It was trying to like determine what build pack to use and everything. But we're running that. We're running all of our commands. Everything is good. I'm confident that some of this process will work. It's going to just be the actual starting of the app that's going to have a problem. We might not even see the error here because I don't think supervisor D is going to put its errors here, but we'll find out. Okay, so now it's installing like supervisor, cool. Here we go. What else is happening here? Tagging a registry, awesome. And I think this is the last thing. So now, in theory, it built. So from a infrastructure point of view, we pretty much have this working. But from a code point of view and configuration, there's actually some stuff we still need to fix. For instance, if I actually open this app now, we just get a bad gateway error. If I try to go to /API with another slash, I think, we get a bad gateway error. All these kind of things. And it's because, and if we set up logging and stuff, we'd probably see this. It's because when the Dart server actually got started, there were some major errors thrown because it doesn't have a database to work with as one. So let's get that in place. So resources. In Heroku, one great thing I think about Heroku is like under one billing model, you can basically have your database and stuff like that, which is, pretty cool. So let's search for that. Postgres, Heroku Postgres. Now keep in mind, you can use RDS. In fact, Heroku Postgres is running on RDS under the hood in like a shared RDS instance, but we're going to pick the cheapest one. You can, of course, choose whatever. Now, I do recommend if you're trying to get your app into production, at least start with the $50 one if you're trying to do this for real. That might seem like a lot, but it's worth it. The main reason is upgrading anything from here to here is actually a huge nightmare in my experience with Heroku. Once you get to the $50 tier, there's actually a way better upgrade process. So you can get to this one with just a command instead of having to like dump your data and do all this stuff. I'm going to pick the $5 one. And if you're just doing this for testing purposes, yeah, go with the $5 one. It's good enough. It's good enough as long as you don't have a million users coming. And we'll submit that order form. So this will take a minute to go. Similarly, although we're not using Redis at all, so I'm not going to worry about it, but you can also set up Redis through here. You can also, if you don't want to get down and dirty with AWS to set up your AWS S3 bucket, there's a couple of packages. One is called HDrive, and then I think there's Bucketeer. Yeah, I've used both of these. Honestly, don't use them like unless it's really just like, oh, I'm just doing this for testing purposes, because it's way more expensive. Like you're ultimately like anything on Heroku, what's great is like what you're going to pay to the minute. Everything's like prorated, and there's not anything that I know of on Heroku that's like the cost will fluctuate based on usage. It's all like you provisioning something that has a max amount of power. The problem with these two plugins or add-ons as they call them, which these are both third-party add-ons, is they give you pretty minimal limits in terms of your bandwidth every month. And then you're only really forced to do is either migrate all your data to, what you should probably do at that point is migrate it to just your own S3, or you have to upgrade. And the upgrade it's a pretty like steep jump from like, the cheap one to the next one. So if you're just trying to be like, I don't want to have to set up an AWS account and I just want to get this going easily and it's just for dev, sure, use HDrive, whatever, use Bucketeer. Just know like you're going to eventually have to migrate away if you want to keep your costs in, because all those things they're just a wrapper on top of, they're just operating their own S3 bucket for you, and they're just basically like charging more than they're paying. So you get cheaper if you go right with the S3. All right, so this is still going. That's cool. It'll be up soon, and the cool thing is it will put a database URL for us here. So there's our database URL, awesome. But we need some other settings too, because the way we're going to be doing our configuration. So if I remember correctly, we need a couple of things. So we have our database URL, that's automatic. We need a Serverpod secret, Serverpod service secret, and we're just going to set this to ABC 123. Obviously, do something a lot more random, and that's meant for, I believe, anything like cryptography based or whatever. Serverpod will kind of use this as part of the process, whether it's like salting passwords or something, so that it just makes things more secure. Now, if you have AWS here and you're not using HDrive and stuff, you will need to configure your AWS keys. So you'd have your client or your client ID and your secret. You would just do those as two separate items, like in the last video you saw. But the example project I made isn't even using AWS, so isn't using cloud file storage. So we should be good there. Yeah, I think that's the only settings we really care about. So let's see if this finished going. If our database is ready. It is. It's ready to go. Okay, so now what we need to do is just, because of the way Serverpod is, so just to sort of re-explain this again, the way Serverpod works with configuration, which personally I don't love. It's something that I would, kind of, if I was like working there or whatever, I'd be like, we should do this a little bit differently. I don't love the way they do the config. I don't love that there's a production.yaml or staging.yaml. Like these things should all be, in my opinion, set based on your environment as like environment secrets, like we kind of were just showing right here. Like there should be things that you're doing in here. That way you can have multiple things and it's good. And then secondly, although like it's good that this is not version controlled, because it shouldn't be, we don't really have a way to put this in our environment in a nice way. In theory, I guess you could paste all of this file and then we could reparse it and stuff and copy it where it wanted when it starts up, but it doesn't fit with, I think, the way like a 12 factor apps sort of go. They use these like environment variables. So that's why, and you see in the last video, I kind of like reworked how we should be doing configuration. That's what we're going to set up now. So all we really care about is the database. This is the database password and the database service secret. But we also need, in our production environment, what other things are here? We need our host for our database, our port, all that kind of stuff. And magically, that's all things that are inside this URL that Heroku automatically made for us. So we want to essentially parse that. So I'm just going to close a lot of things here, and we're going to do our first bit of Dart code just to get this set up. So what I'm going to do in right as a sibling to this, so reveal and explorer, you could put this, actually, I mean, maybe it makes sense to be somewhere else, but I'm just going to put it right in the lib folder. And we're just going to call this environment settings. You could just call this env if you wanted. And what we're going to do in our server is actually add one little package. Okay, so we're going to do dart pub add .env, all one word. And what we're going to do now is right in the root of our server, so not in the lib folder, but in the SP cloud server or whatever your thing's called, we're going to make a .env file. And most importantly, in our git ignore, and we'll just go to the root git ignore, which would be, oh, we don't have a root git ignore, so we'll just do it in the server git ignore. We want to just make sure that that file is not version controlled. So you see it's green right now, and now it's gray because we've said, hey, we're not version controlling this. Because this is going to be like our local environment settings for working locally. So in order to get this going, well, we need to put some things in. That way we can test before we actually deploy. We don't want to just blindly deploy. So the first thing we actually need is our database URL. And this is essentially what we take from our passwords, a combination of our passwords and our local environment. So let's just look at those files and make sure we have them right. So we'll go into development.yaml, and we want to look for the database specifically. So it's using localhost, which there we have it, at localhost. For port, we want to be using 8090. Okay. The name of the database, though, we need to change. So I'm going to change this to SP Cloud. Cool. And then our username is Postgres, but the password is not this. This is a password from a different project. So let's look at our passwords. And in development, we just need our database password. So grab that. Don't include the quotes, just what's inside the quotes. And we want to basically put that right after this here, right after the colon. And this is just a normal like database URI that's saying this is the username, this is the password split by this, at this host on this port, this is the name of the database. Standard DB database URL. So we want to put that in there so that locally, whether we're working locally or working remote, it's going to use the same path to get these things, and it should be good. Secondly, for local, we actually don't want to be using our database doesn't have SSL. It's not secure in terms of SSL. It's local. It's running on just local hosts. It's just basically won't be using SSL. So I came up with this concept of just calling a database no SSL. Technically, you can call this whatever you want. You just have to make sure the code we're about to write will conform to that. And we also need a Serverpod secret. And let's just make this foobar. Beautiful. So we need those. And my idea here, obviously, this is very basic, but as we go through in the Open Mic project more, we're going to be using all of our configuration is going to be done in this approach. I just think it's much nicer, especially when you're thinking about working with multiple people, especially when you're thinking about your DevOps. We kind of need things laid out in this way. And this is just normal, look up 12-factor app. This is what, the way things are done. So there, we have that. Cool. Let's go here and environment settings, and we're going to create a class for this. So we're going to make something called class environment settings. And there's a few things that we're going to load in here. So we're going to have 3 late variables. One will be of type .env, which that's the package we just installed. So let's get that going there. One will be of type database config, which comes from Serverpod. And one will just be a string of our service secret. And of course, as you add more and more variables, you can, of course, do this. And then what we want to do is in the constructor for environment settings, which we're not going to take any parameters, we are going to set this late variable just by using our .env .load. But specifically, we want to say include platform environment true, because that will look for variables in our environment as opposed to in the file. Because we're not going to have this .env file in the cloud. It's not going to be part of our code that's running on a server. We're going to be relying on the actual environment variables that we've injected using these kind of things on whatever platform as a service we're using. So first we're going to do that. Cool, we've set that. Luckily it's not even asynchronous. This is a synchronous operation, so that's great. And then what we want to check, because our application just will not work if we don't have a database URL, unless you're using like Serverpod Mini, in which case like getting that running on a cloud I'm sure is a lot easier. It's just like it doesn't need all this stuff. So what we want to check is if env database URL is null, we're just going to throw an exception. Similarly, Serverpod requires this to be set. If the Serverpod secret is not set, we're just going to throw an exception, and basically the app won't, the Serverpod won't run. It'll just kind of like start up and throw this exception and close down, giving us as the developer or whatever, like some insight into what the problem was. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to set some things. So let's set the service secret first, because that's very, very simple. So we're just going to set that late setting to this right here. Service secret equals this. We're setting this. Cool. And we have to use this here because technically Dart thinks this could be null, even though we've proven it isn't, because we would be throwing an exception. Cool. So we'll just do that. And then the more challenging but totally manageable thing is we need to now parse our database URL and get it in the way that Serverpod is expecting it. So let's parse that just by basically, we're going to make something called dbURI. We're just going to take that database URL. We're going to force it saying it's not null, because we've already proven it's not null by getting past this. Then we're going to set our database config. So database config, just this value here, equals database config. And now we actually have to set these things. So let me just see if I can get this to look a little cleaner. Okay, so we can get the host very easily. We can take our dbURI. It's a URI, so it has lots of cool, it's parsed it, and it's kind of like figured out what are the pieces of this. So host is really simple. It's just dbURI.host. dbURI.port. That's also simple. User's a little more complicated. What we actually have to do is get our dbURI.userinfo. And what the user info is in this context is everything after this slash, but before the @ sign. So there's actually two values in here. So we're going to take our user info, but we're going to split it on that colon, which gives us a list. And then we actually want to get the first thing in that list to get the user. With password, we can do kind of the same thing. And we could do, last. If you really wanted to like optimize this to the extent of whatever, you could in theory do this split as like a different variable here and just get the first and last. But I think a split is probably pretty optimized, especially since this just runs once. Compared to everything else that's happening on startup, this is nothing. We are going to keep it like that. Now for name, we actually just get this from dbURI.path segments, and similarly .first. And path segments are basically everything after the slash. So if this was like, like that, this would be first, or index 0, index 1, index 2. So yeah, rather than us like parsing it manually, which of course you could do pretty easily, we can use URI.parse to make this nicer. Now the last important thing is whether we want to use SSL or not. So you'll see one of the properties of database config, which this is just a pretty basic class, is requiring SSL. On Heroku and pretty much staging production, like outside of basically our local like Docker Compose world of running our development, we're going to want SSL. So we could happily put true here and just make it the default and everything's good. But that's going to run into problems because locally it's just not going to work. It's not going to be able to connect because we don't have SSL running. So that's why what I decided to do is we're actually going to make a variable called db_no_ssl, and it's going to check to see if this value is equal to true. Now remember, this could be null. So if it's completely omitted, it's going to be false. db_no_ssl false. If it says the word false, it'll be false. If it says anything but the word true, it's going to be just the default. Meaning we need to take this value and negate it. So just a exclamation mark to do the the inverse. Not db_no_ssl. And the value of doing it this way instead of like database SSL and then relying on it like this is now in production, we don't have to worry about setting that, because to me, this will be the standard like default anyways. And just locally, so in our env file, we just need to say, hey, our database is not going to use SSL. Cool, don't use it. Awesome. And we're good. Of course, in the comments, if you can think of a better wording or something a little less confusing, because I know that might be a tiny bit confusing, definitely let me know. The other approach is, yeah, we could have just decided to require that as a field. Required in general, like here we could say, we could have called like database uses SSL, and if it's not set, like throw an error. But I kind of like just having defaults of things when it can be determined on what a default should be. So obviously a database URL can't really have a default, that kind of thing. It's going to be different everywhere. But yeah, that's just the approach that I took. Okay, so now we have this lovely thing going. And what we're going to do right at the start of our run command in our server is let's make something called like env settings equals environment settings. So it's going to construct this. And again, this is just going to run this code here, do all this stuff, and set these late variables here. So we have access to them. Now, inside our pod here, I was lucky that there is a way to do this, or I don't know what I would have done. But we're going to have config. And what we can use is serverpod config. And here we have some different things that we're able to configure. Now we do have to configure, unfortunately, as soon as we decide to use this, it's going to override all the defaults. So we do need to put in things like our API server, right there. And I've actually realized this can just be blank. It really doesn't care what it is. We just have to say whether it's going to use HTTPS or not, which I realize that's interesting. Does this work locally then? I've had it work locally, so it should be fine. So we're just going to put this in. These are just the defaults anyways. We're running on port 8080, and the public port is 8080. We also need to do the web server and the insight server, so let's just do that. And I'm just going to, instead of a blank URL, just do api.example. I'm going to, in the future, kind of see, what can we do with this stuff, and is it actually necessary? But I have stuff working without it. So we needed to do that, just because as soon as you basically put in a server config, it's like, hey, we are using, you have to have this. It's going to override it. And then we need to configure our database. And here we can just take our env settings.database config, right? Because this is expecting a database config, and of course we made a database config. I thought this one through. And lastly, we need to pass our secret in. So we can just use env secret. Okay. All right, so now we have that. We're going to get our environment stuff. It's going to get our database URL. It's going to do all those things, and hopefully we are in business. So let's commit those changes. Let's do environment settings. And I don't think I missed anything, but we're about to find out. So now, because we don't have automatic deployment set up, I do just have to click the manual deploy, which I think is a totally fair thing to do. Like, just do it when you want. Obviously, when we know everything's set up, this is probably a good thing to do, just to have your CI/CD. In a perfect world, you never would be working in your main branch. You'd be working in like a dev branch, right? And you do all your stuff there, and then you would merge to usually like staging first, and then merge to main, and you'd have your staging Heroku app and your main Heroku app, so you can kind of get things out. And you would set these up to CI, basically like CI/CD. All right, so it's going, it's doing stuff. Nothing really different is going to happen here than we saw last time, because we didn't change anything in our Docker file. It's really just some Serverpod code that we changed. There we go. And if we just go back to the activity feed now, we should see this as deployed. And let's click open app and see. Oh, no. Yeah, it might still just be going. There we go. We're up. We're running. So there you have it. We're running on just on the .com itself. We have the web server. Cool. Now, hopefully this works. If I go /API/, and then this is where you would obviously, this is what you would be using. There we have it. We have the wonderful API. This is just like a status thing that Serverpod sends back. Like, try this locally. You'll get the same thing, but you have to, type in port 8081 or 8080, I think, for that. We're using the same port, and everything's magic and it's working. Same with insights. You'll get the same kind of message. Insights seems to be broken. I wonder why. There might be some setting you have to do to get insights working. This was just a plain project I got up. I'm going to take a quick look at what that could be and see why we're getting an error back. All right, I figured out the problem locally. It was just easier to figure out this locally. So I started this up, and I got a error coming back. Insight server disabled because the invalid service secret. So I think it was just like, that's not really a secret enough value. So I've taken the one from my passwords file just to conform to that, and at least locally, and we should be good on that. What I'll do is I'll take the production one, which would be in, that'd be in passwords, I guess so. yeah, service secret. Let's take this service secret here, and let's actually replace this right in our resources. So we'll go to settings, reveal config, and we just had ABC123, so I imagine it's the same problem. We'll click the edit button, change this. Now what's cool is we don't have to do a code deploy or anything. If this is in fact what caused our issue. What you'll see if we go to activity, we'll see we're actually it did a new build, but it didn't actually do the whole build. It basically just restarted it with the new environment variable. And now if we go back here where we had 502 bad gateway, we're actually getting this back. So I guess, yeah, keep your, your secrets can't just be the word foobar or, ABC123. I learned something new today. They're just watching out for us. Thanks, Serverpod team. All right, thank you for watching this. Wicked. I am going to play around for a bit with getting these maybe running in different places. I know not everyone wants to support Salesforce and Heroku, I'm sure there's maybe there might be some cheaper options out there. I'm going to see where we can get this running and report back in the next video. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder, if you want to join, I have a pretty fun subscription going on with a bunch of people. We have a Discord. We have access to the source code. Although I will be putting the source code in this video up, the source code for our full open mic project is only available right now to people that are part of my Discord. And to be part of the Discord, you need to be a member. So lots of other perks too. It's cool. Come hang out. Come have a good time. $3.99 a month. Sponsor this video. Me. All right. Take care. Have a great day.